All right, everybody, hold on for just 1 second. We want to make sure that we're up and running on all of our various platforms here across the interwebs, and we will get going in just 1 second here with our various guests. All right, so we are up and running here live on Facebook. This is Jeff Martin with Magic City Books. I'm so thrilled to have you with us. We're talking to you, at least I am, from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and it's about 101 degrees outside. So I'm thrilled to be in a nice air-conditioned room talking to people on Zoom for once. You know, it's been one of those moments where you want to get back out in public, but today is a great day to be chatting in the room here. So excited to have tonight's event. Before we jump into that, I do want to encourage you all to go to our website, magiccitybooks.com. You can see all the different things we have lined up. We have many, many events in the next couple of months, but we are going to be kind of easing our way back into some in-person events later in the summer, some outdoor programs. And so you can see all the details about that at magiccitybooks.com. I will mention one event of note. On July 7th, we're going to be doing an event with Adam Serwer from The Atlantic, and Ta-Nehisi Coates will be in conversation with Adam for a new book called The Cruelty is the Point, which should be pretty powerful. And then actually next Monday, we're going to be doing kind of a Juneteenth celebration. Juneteenth, of course, just became a federal holiday today, which is wonderful news. But we're going to be talking to John Callahan, who is Ralph Ellison's literary executor, and Charles Johnson, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Middle Passage, for a new edition of Ralph Ellison's Juneteenth, which just came out from Vintage. So that'll be on Monday night. So check the website for all those different details. We have had a chance over the last year. We've done about 160 virtual author events in the last year, and we've had a chance to talk to so many great authors. And but I think we have not had the opportunity that we have tonight to kind of have two people who I think have written what I think will be two books that will be vying for many of the big end of year awards and honors. I think two of the best books of the year. We're early in 2021 still, but I think these books are going to be on that Mount Rushmore of best books of the year. So really, really excited about that. I'm also excited because I get to sit back and be an audience member like you guys tonight and turn my moderating duties over. And tonight we're going to be joined by Dwyer Murphy, who is the editor at Crime Reads and Lit Hub and a contributor to many, many publications, will be moderating tonight's conversation. And thank you for doing that. But to our guests tonight, we have Mr. Jonathan Lee, author of The Great Mistake, which was just published 2 days ago here in the US and yesterday in the UK. So it's been quite a big and busy week, and it's wonderful to see all the reviews rolling in for this book. And also, of course, Patricia Engel, whose book Infinite Country really, I would be remiss to try to describe what it is, but it's a journey unlike any other I've been on this year. And I'm sure Dwyer and John will speak to that as well. But so we're going to have kind of this three-way conversation. John and Patricia and Dwyer will be talking about these books and much more. If you guys have questions, please put those into the Q&A, and we'll pull some of those while we go along. And most importantly, you guys need these books, and we're going to make that quite easy for you here by putting links in the chat. You can buy them directly through Magic City Books. We are a nonprofit bookstore, and all the money used into us through these book sales supports our programs. Of course, goes back to the authors and all the things that we're doing here in our community. And we're doing a very big special tonight, which is 2 books for the price of 2. You get Patricia's book and you get Jonathan's book. It's a pretty great deal. Take advantage of that. One night only. So with that, I will turn it over to our moderator, Dwyer Murphy. I'll say thank you to John, thank you to Patricia, and have a great event. We're excited to watch.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff. And thanks to Magic City for having us. This is a real treat for us too, I think, and something we're all really looking forward to. So I'll just kick it off by, I'd like to talk about sort of the bigger themes of both of your books, because I think on the surface, the plot descriptions may not sound like they have a great deal in common, but I think having read them both intensely and recently, the themes really resonate for me together too. So I'd like to start off by kind of asking you both to tell me a little bit about what you think are the sort of bigger themes of your book that you're writing about. There's always a difference between the exact subject matter that you're tackling and what you feel you're writing on a different plane. So maybe John, you could kick us off with, your book, The Great Mistake, which is out now, obviously has as its subject Andrew Haswell Green, a founding father of New York. But there's so much more going on. This is a story about a true man, and yet it's an epic novel and piece of fiction. So maybe John, you could kick us off and tell us about what you think the themes of that book are.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dwyer, for doing this, and Patricia too. Here's the book. I mean, The Great Mistake is, as some of you might know, it's about a real 19th century civic leader. His name was Andrew Haswell Green. He ended up being murdered on Park Avenue at the age of 83, kind of after creating modern New York. He was, a real person without whom there would probably be no Central Park, no Metropolitan Museum of Art, no New York Public Library. He consolidated the existing city of New York with Brooklyn into a single city, which the New York Times called The Great Mistake on its front page at the time, which is partly where the title comes from. And yet he's been entirely forgotten. So I guess in part the novel is about how history is made and who's pushed to the margins, and how does someone like that get forgotten when they've done so much. I think also one of the things that really fascinated me from the outset was that he was such a private guy. And I think that was partly on account of his sexuality, but like lots of other things that sort of made him within New York at the time something of an outcast. But I think he was such a private guy, and he had this public death, being shot dead on Park Avenue, like the blood, the guts, the inside coming out. And of course, he devoted his later life to public work. And so I was interested in that tension between the two. And I mean, one of many lines that I love in your novel, Patricia, is something along the lines of, I often wonder if we're living the wrong life in the wrong country. And I think there was a sense in him that he never, completely belonged in his own life or even in New York. And yet he sort of changed it forever.
Patricia, tell us a bit about Infinite Countries. So to set the scene, I guess, for people, the story, the bigger story, is about a family who migrates from Colombia to the United States, and various iterations of borders and citizenship status and family events end up separating them in a way that I think is more common than many of us know or like to think. And part of the family is in the United States, part of the family is in Colombia, and there's movements back and forth between them. But there's so much more going on in this book. And Patricia, it seems to me such a timely and ambitious project. I'd love to hear a bit about what you felt you were writing about, what themes were resonating with you as you were working through this.
Sure. Well, first I want to congratulate Jonathan on his amazing book that everyone should pick up. And thanks to both of you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. So I love sort of what Jonathan was just saying now about how in The Great Mistake, his protagonist sort of belongs to the place but doesn't belong to it, and there's just this kind of interrogating that question of what you belong to and what you don't belong to. And just look at how New York City has forgotten someone who probably devoted their life to it more than almost anybody else. And there's also the idea of what we give our lives to, what are our causes. For some people, it's a cause, it's an issue or something like that. And sometimes the cause is your family, as is the case in Infinite Country. So Infinite Country is a story that's about a family in the process of emigrating. Of course, almost everybody in the United States has immigration somewhere in their family story, but I wanted to show a family that was in the active process, where it's very much alive, a very, very much breathing animal still, and really is having an active role on your day-to-day life. But it's also a love story. It's a story about, two teenagers who fall in love, and then the much larger story of the family that they make together. And it's a story about how they toe the lines of love and all the failures and forgiveness and shortcomings that come along with that. And also how that love translates into their relationships with their children and the country they leave behind and their new homelands. And around that love is a lot of complication and the passage of time and sacrifice and all these nuances and doubts and all those things. And it's never perfect. It's not always pretty, but that doesn't, take away from its value. So it's an exploration of all those things. It asks those questions. I don't know if it answers them all, certainly, but basically, I wanted to write a book that really reflected the intricacies and complications and complexities of immigration in the form of a family unit, the way that I saw it, the way I've witnessed it, and the way that I've lived it.
It's so interesting to hear you say this. You're telling the story of sort of the process of immigration and the effects on the family, but you're also mentioning that this is in many ways a love story. And I think that that's often something that an author might discover about their own story as they're working through it. That's when maybe you're doing it right. And I'm curious, John, and The Great Mistake, you've got this towering public figure forgotten to history, and you have as the backdrop the story of the creation of modern New York City. But at some point, the novel does morph into a love story. And I think that catches the reader maybe a little off guard in the most exciting way. And I'm wondering if that caught you off guard as well.
It did a little bit. I think that, I started off thinking that I was writing about the murder case, really, because, when Andrew Haswell Green was shot dead on Park Avenue, the headlines on the Times were father of Greater New York shot in front of his home, assailant probably insane. And that probably is the kind of thing, the kind of word that makes you lean in as a novelist. I think you're like, wait, probably insane? What were the circumstances of this thing? So I started researching that. And there's a Virginia Woolf line that I've admittedly relayed to a couple of different people this week, but in her diaries, she said of another project, I meant to write about death, only life came breaking in as usual. And it was a little bit like that for me. I think I thought I was writing about his ending, and it became a novel that was more and more about his beginnings. And like when he was young, he was sort of falling in love all the time, but feeling that he needed to restrain himself from that. And like one element of that was family love, as in Patricia's novel so powerfully. In his case, he was a child of 9. I think he had 9 siblings, and it was a household that had sort of had money at one time, but had come upon very difficult times. And he was growing up in Massachusetts, and his father felt that like the way he held the axe was sort of effeminate. And there were all of these sort of little moments where it was sort of felt that he wasn't a man's man in the way that his brothers were, or that he wasn't going to turn into that. And I think that sort of missed love with his own father was very damaging to him, and is something that came through the diaries and letters that I was able to get hold of that were really exciting to read. And then later in life, the central relationship is with Samuel Tilden, who was the governor of New York, and then lost what was called the stolen presidential election at the time. He won the popular vote, one of those many echoes of contemporary times that are in the book and in the story. And with them, it was kind of a case of missed love as well. I think they had a relationship that was like more than platonic, but also was kind of unconsummated. So you've got this sort of presence and absence wrapped in one, kind of in their relationship with each other. And I found that really interesting to try and unpack.
You have that great Virginia Woolf line that I'll mess it up now, but it's, I started out writing about death and ended up writing about life. And it brings to mind a bit, both of your novels, I think, and I won't even limit it to these novels, but you both have these tremendous opening sequences in the novels. For you, John, you're talking about this, a murder on the steps of a Park Avenue building. And Patricia in Infinite Country, we have this really dramatic escape from a girls' juvenile detention center in the mountains of Colombia. And I would point back to, Patricia, one of your earlier books too, The Veins of the Ocean, which for my money just has maybe the best opening sequence of 50 pages, the most powerful I've read in a very long time. And there too, there's just a breathtakingly violent and terrifying crime at the center of it. And I think that you both seem to have tendencies towards openings that are dramatic and maybe violent or skew towards the heart pounding. And Patricia, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about where that opening sequence comes from, and maybe just give readers out there who haven't had a chance to start the book yet a little bit of context of what's happening. And I won't do it justice, but it's truly breathtaking.
Well, the why is, just I think any storyteller just likes to go for that big hook at the beginning. But very often, at least in my case, in writing a book, those are the moments that came, that I heard about or became images that really sort of got my mind going with the whole larger story. And that's why I kind of love to give them their respect and place them at the beginning of the book. With the Veins of the Ocean, there's a baby being tossed off a bridge. That was from a story my mom told me, and I ended up writing a short story that then became the first chapter of a novel. And that just started with a toss away remark that my mom made once. With Infinite Country, the novel begins with a 15-year-old girl named Talia escaping from a juvenile correction center in the mountains, in the Andes Mountains in Colombia. And so you see her breaking out, and the first line is that it was her idea to tie up the nun, which is one of the guardians of this facility. And also that it was something that came to me years and years and years ago, when I think before I even wrote The Veins of the Ocean. So this was like more than 10 years ago, where I read like a small headline on some small online news publication from Colombia saying that like a dozen teenage girls had escaped from a reform school in the mountains, and they had just dispersed into the mountains and nobody knew where they were. And I never heard anything else about it, to know what happened to them, if they were recovered or what. But I just sort of archived that, as we writers do. A bunch of girls breaking out, badass young women breaking out of a prison for youth offenders and into the Andes Mountains. And it just stuck there for a long time. And then when I started to put together the idea of writing a novel about a family, a family experience, the collective experience of a family, and also what I had hoped to do at that time was get into their private experiences as well. That image just sort of came to the surface. And as you're saying with the Virginia Woolf quote, just sort of like interrupted the novel I was already writing, just announced itself and was like, I need to be here too. And so it ended up being the first line that I wrote of the novel.
And John, I'm curious to hear about, you certainly have a proclivity too for that engaging opening, let's call it, but here it's a murder on Park Avenue. How did this come to you? Was that the genesis of the novel for you, or did that come later? How did that opening sequence take shape? And tell readers, please, a little bit about it too, because it really is a fascinating incident from history turned into fiction.
Yeah, I think perhaps it was similar to Patricia. I love that you saw that headline, and it's sometimes those are the perfect stories where you see the headline but you don't know the rest. It really fires your imagination up. I think for me, like the equivalent of the headline was sort of taking a walk in Central Park one day in, I think, 2012. I was corrected the other day that it was 2012 rather than 2011. And I came across this bench in a quiet part of Central Park overlooking the open greenery of Fort Fish. And it was a hot day and it was kind of the only place to sit down, and it was shaded by 5 trees, which I later learned were planted to be symbolic of the 5 boroughs. And on the bench, it was engraved with the words, in honor of Andrew Haswell Green, creating genius of Central Park, father of Greater New York. And it just sort of it just fired up my curiosity, the same as you, Patricia, with that news headline. I think I just wanted to know who this guy was that I hadn't heard of, if he was indeed deserving of the title of father of New York. And so I took out my phone and I opened a new window and I began to look into his life. And at first, all I could find was about his death. There was very little about him because he really has slid into forgetting. And his death was, of course, fascinating because, you don't expect to be murdered at all, but you don't expect to be murdered outside your handsome Park Avenue home in broad daylight at the age of 83 after creating modern New York. So I sort of started to look into that a little bit. And I think it felt right to me to, in a sense, to start the novel with the thing that had hooked me and brought me into his story first, and then peer behind the headlines and try and find the quieter, more subtle stuff afterwards. And I feel like the Hollywood version is often that you take a big moment and then you amplify it even further. And my feeling is probably that both Patricia and I are a little interested in like maybe making the big moment and then looking for the quieter resonances behind it instead of turning the volume up to 100.
I'll pause for a moment to just let people out there who are watching know that they can leave questions in the chat function or on Facebook anytime, and we'll weave some things into conversation as we go. So anybody who wants to interrupt here, please feel free, and we'll find a way to incorporate you into the conversation. But in the meantime, I want to talk a little bit about research, because I think you both kind of mentioned there, Patricia, I think for you, maybe that was more serendipity than directed research. John, you kind of hinted at it too, but I suspect that for both of you and for both of these novels, there were some interesting trails to be dug through. Patricia, I'm particularly interested in how, so your novel has a few different chronologies, because you're moving, you have a narrator who is one of the members of this family, as we discover in the book, but the perspective and the voice of the story does shift to different characters. And as part of that, we're getting different timelines too, both closer to modern day here in the US. And then we're also having an earlier period in Colombia that I think is, I want to situate it just after the death of Escobar and that era of civil unrest in Colombia. But I'm curious how you sort of recreated the fabric of day-to-day life in Colombia in that period, because it feels so intimate and lived. And just judging by your age, I can see that you certainly weren't there in that exact period as a sentient adult or anything. But I'm curious how you recreated that day-to-day life in Colombia during that period.
That's a really good question. A lot of it is, I was here in the United States, but my parents are Colombians and I have a ton of family in Colombia. So Infinite Country is largely set in Bogota, which is my mother's hometown and where her entire family still lives. So while I was in the United States in the 90s, when all this was happening, I was hearing about it regularly in my household. My parents were very connected to what my mom's family was experiencing at the time. And also the news. And it was the reason why we couldn't visit, why we couldn't see each other. The violence was just a daily disturbance in every single way. So those are things, I had access to, that sort of far away knowledge and far away experience. But also I have spent, in the years since, I have spent a lot of time in Colombia, and then research kind of builds upon that. There's, of course, the facts, the events as they happened. And then there's what I know from people who I know who were there and lived through it. And then there's the writer's work, the artist's work, which is the extra dimension, the imagining, the nuance, the details, building those bridges of connection between the characters and the reader. And then there's a lot more research that also went into Infinite Country, which is, of course, about the legal processes that changed. Since the novel takes place over 20 or so years, from the late 90s up until 2018, a lot has changed, both in the United States, especially after 9/11, and the way that foreigners were perceived and described by the media as a result of the war on terror. The creation of the Department of Homeland Security, which gave way to ICE, and things changed drastically in the United States for foreigners and for immigrants. And similarly, Colombia went through its own transformation. The violence continued for a very long time, but lo and behold, in 2016, there was a peace process, which, you know, has since also been proven very delicate and vulnerable. But it is a big change from where we were in the 90s. So I want to show the evolution of these two countries, how the United States has become possibly even more violent than Colombia in terms of, you know, how we have all these mass shootings happening regularly, and just how things have evolved. There was a lot of research that went into that. Also the legal processes related to immigration, how those laws have changed. And then also there's an element in Infinite Country that has to do with ancestral knowledge and traditional history, that a lot of those stories I knew about because my mother's from the region, and you know, I grew up with some of them. But also that just kind of opens the door, you know, to the curiosity. And then as a writer, because I think that we need to be responsible, I go even much deeper into the research in order to get it right for the people who know more than I do, for the people who care. And because I think that's, you know, the ethics of a writer. You have to be respectful with your research and your describing of real places and real peoples, real communities.
And John, what was the research process for you? Because you're dealing with, you know, a real person here. And as Patricia said, there's an element of making sure that you're getting this right and, you know, telling a novel, a fictional story, but, you know, you're using the events of his life, this man who was, you know, a large public figure. And I'm really curious about how you dug in to his life and what you felt you owed to the subject in that sense.
Yeah, and if you can tell that Patricia isn't old enough to have been around at the time, you know that I wasn't around in 1903 to do the autofiction version of this. But I mean, I was, the word research almost doesn't cover it, because I sort of think of that as being about sort of bolstering a case or sort of finding out what you need in order to make a story work. And I was really lucky early on to get access at the New York Historical Society Library to this treasure trove of like primary documents, like Andrew Haswell Green's unpublished diaries and letters. And I think like The Great Mistake probably wouldn't exist as a book without those documents, because I think if I hadn't found them, I probably wouldn't have had enough grist to kind of work with. And it was really like finding out about his interior life and how he was feeling, for example, when he first arrived in New York at the age of 15, that really opened up the book for me. And it was kind of especially fascinating to just to look at it with hindsight, to know that this guy ended up creating Central Park and the New York Public Library, among many other things. And when he arrives in New York at the age of 15, in his diaries, he's complaining about the fact that he loves to walk and he loves to read, and he can't afford either, because all the libraries are private libraries in New York at that point, and all of the safe places to walk are pleasure gardens that are ticketed and are priced to keep gentlemen in and keep everyone else out. So it kind of became fascinating to think about whether he even would have become who he became if he'd had a different start in life, you know, and that those sort of happy accidents and then the unhappy accidents, the unhappy mistakes, became a big part of what the book's about, yes.
I'm really curious. So you mentioned that there was that detail that kind of unlocked the bigger story for you, his arrival in New York City, which is a very dramatic sequence. And I think he arrives by ship, maybe from Rhode Island or something, to New York. And it's a really dramatic, sort of scary moment. You feel intensely the vulnerability of this 15-year-old boy who's off on his own with a family that has sent him into exile, essentially, in one of the biggest, toughest cities in the world. That it must have been, I was very moved to read that passage. And likewise, Patricia, in Infinite Country, I found some of the most moving passages. This family's, their first days in the US. I want to say that they first arrive in Texas, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that that's their first starting off point within the US, and they have some connections there, kind of loose family, friend of friend acquaintance connections that can help them get started. But reading those passages about a young couple who has migrated to the US, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting if they're pregnant at that time or if they already have a child, but the vulnerability of these people who sort of undertook a journey. It's a very different sort of immigration journey. And I think that you do an amazing job in this book of telling, there's all these different reasons why people move around the world, and none of them is necessarily that one story that we are sometimes told in newspapers about why people come to the US or do something different. But this family had very specific and different and complex reasons for wanting to come here. And those early days in the US, when they're so vulnerable, but also excited and scared, you tell that so vividly. And I'd love to hear you tell us a bit more about how you created those scenes and what you were feeling and going through yourself and kind of recreating those early days of a family in the US.
Yeah, thank you. Elena and Mauro, they come with their baby daughter. They only have one child at that point. They arrive in Houston as tourists with tourist visas, which is actually a very, very common way that people come to the United States and end up being immigrants. So you see that at that time, they don't think of themselves as immigrants. They're just two, young people who lucked into tourist visas for 6 months, and they do what a lot of people do, which is they think, well, we're going to go check it out, see the country, have a good time, work, save some money, and come back home. And it happens that they decide to overstay when Elena finds out that she's pregnant again. And they're confronted with the first decision in a series of decisions, of small decisions that end up, accumulating, and to the point where they have a whole new life in a new country, just by making the decision again and again to stay a little longer, see if, they can, make something work out, or at least, get a little more bang for their buck. So when they go back home, they've got a little bit more money to help out with back home. And then just time passes and life happens and their family grows, and they end up being undocumented, something that they were not when they arrived. So that was something that I wanted to show, because a lot of people, because the media, have this idea that the immigration only exists, at the borders, and where people just trying to bang down the walls to America. And that's not the case. And a lot of people are very ambivalent about being immigrants, and it happens almost accidentally. And this is, totally normal as well. As you mentioned, there's movement, so much movement, because to move is a natural human instinct. It's how we survive. It's how we have survived. It's how the world as we know it came to be, because of movement. Animals do it to provide for their young, and we think it's beautiful and remarkable, and humans do it, and we look down on them and think, well, they should just stay where they are, or something, just because somebody mapped out borderlines around them. So in those early days, as you mentioned in the book, you get to see that push and pull. Home is still fresh in their minds. It's still waiting for them. When they left, it was not goodbye forever in their minds. And for a very long time, they have the very real idea that they're going to go back. It's just a matter of when, what day, and over time, that sort of door gets, recedes further and further behind them, as happens. And one day they open their eyes and realize they've got more of a life in this country than almost in the one that they left behind. And that's also something that I witnessed all the time, because I grew up around immigrants and immigrant communities, where there's always this idea that you're going to go back. And then one day you realize you're not. And if you do go back, it will be in an entirely different way,
One of the questions that were coming from some of our viewers and readers out there, wanting to know about connections between the different books that you've written. And the way I'd like to ask this is, I think that often authors have certain preoccupations that work out into their work, their books, time and again, and may not be so obvious to us, but maybe you two have developed a sense of what those preoccupations are, themes that kind of resonate across the different books. So John, for you, let me, I guess, ask in the context of High Dive, which was your last book about an attempted bombing on the life of aimed at Margaret Thatcher from the IRA, and I want to say the 1980s in Brighton in the UK, and this book, which is obviously about an extremely different subject matter, the father of Greater New York. And Patricia, I'll ask the same question of you afterwards. I'd like to hear about some of the themes that you feel like resonate across Infinite Country, Veins of the Ocean, but further back to the other books too. It's not Love, it's just Paris or Vita. I'd really like to hear what you guys think are those sort of preoccupations that are resonating across books here, and sort of notwithstanding subject matter, those things that you're working out time and again. John, if you could start us out here.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose one surface thing that ends up being more than surface when you've spent a few years writing something is that with High Dive and with The Great Mistake now, I think is sort of furthering my interest in having a framework of fact, of kind of forgotten history to operate within. I sort of tend to think I've started to think that there's nothing more fascinating to me than the forgotten past, the bits that, you know, the corners that history sweeps clean, and trying to work out why certain things have been forgotten. I mean, in the case of High Dive, it was, you know, the events were only 1984, this big IRA attempt to assassinate Margaret Thatcher that killed a number of people and injured many other people, and nearly changed the entire course of British history by killing, you know, the Prime Minister, but in its own way still changed so much. It sort of ushered in our new era of terrorism and insecurity, at least in the UK, which is where I was living at the time that I started to write that book. I think in The Great Mistake, you know, it was another thing where I was fascinated by the history, but I loved the gaps as much as I loved the facts. I love the work of carrying out informed imaginings of the moments that might have existed in those gaps. And I also think I seem to be obsessed, at least according to one New Yorker critic, with people failing and falling. Like I keep writing novels about, you know, whether it's a high diver diving off a diving board, or, you know, the sort of some of the memories people had when that hotel collapsed, or whether it's Andrew Haswell Green being shot and falling in the first pages of The Great Mistake, or even in my first novel long ago. I think the first line was something like, it was a Tuesday in September when my mother had a fall. So I seem to be obsessed with falling, and I can only think it's because I think when you know, when people are at their most vulnerable, that's when I lean in a little bit, and especially when it's something that happened in fact but has since been forgotten, I just kind of find something there that draws me in.
Patricia, how about for you? Have you found any surprising themes that resonate across the books?
Well, I don't know, surprising, but you know, all my books, Infinite Country is my fourth book, and so all my books have explored immigration and diaspora in different ways, specifically the Colombian diaspora, which is one of the largest diasporas in the world. There's more than 5 million Colombians living outside of Colombia. Yet when I was, you know, coming up as a young reader and writer, I never saw any of this reflected in, you know, contemporary literature. So that just, you know, outlined my vision for the books I hope to write. But in terms of, you know, sort of the specifics, I would say that if you looked hard into my work, you might see incarceration or captivity, you know, come up in my different novels in different ways. And that's something that has always interested me. Confinement, even in a metaphorical way, just the emotional prisons and experiential prisons that we create for ourselves. And also just loyalties, whether it be to your community, to your country, to your family, and in your relationships. And really those gray areas of morality, good people doing things they never thought that they would do, and good people doing wrong things for the right reasons or the right things for the wrong reasons. And, you know, those kinds of, some people might think that those are just dark explorations, but I actually think that those are, you know, the closest we can get to the truth of the real spectrum of the human experience.
I'm curious to think too. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that for both of you, these books had rather long gestation periods. That these were not. Maybe one of you, you know, had a bender and wrote this in a month, and I'm just mistaken. But I think that this was a fairly long process for both of you, Infinite Country and The Great Mistake. And John, maybe start us off. But am I right in that? And if that is the case, tell us a little bit about the journey that you went through on this, and why it took not so much time, but why it cost you a portion of your life.
Yeah, it did take a long time, and I sort of wrote High Dive, you know, in a sense on a break from this novel, because I think I'd started researching this one first. It was just like a nightmare of research. I mean, it was at the end of this novel, I really told myself that I was gonna focus on writing a contemporary story where I had a lot of autobiographical experience to bring to bear on the subject, other than the autobiography of like discovering this bench in Central Park and disappearing into this person's story. I think it partly took so long just because at the beginning I was trying to capture all of the major events of his life. I think I was sort of trying to write the biography, and I think there's a reason a biography hasn't been written about him, because there are all these sort of gaps in the facts of Andrew Haswell Green's life, so you sort of have to be willing to imagine some of those spaces. But I also had, I spent a lot of time writing big scenes that were around the creation of Central Park and Fort Washington Park and what he did to create the Bronx Zoo in 1899 and Morningside Park in 1867 and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1870 and the American Museum of Natural History at the same time. And it just became, a process of needing several years to take things away and realize that some of the more private moments or just like around the edges of those things were enough to get a sense of him, and actually maybe added more. And I mean, I'm about to give you a really bad cheesy metaphor, but I took my son fishing my 4-year-old son fishing for the first time of the weekend with a neighbor of ours, and he caught, did I tell you this already, Dwight?
No.
Arthur caught 3 fish. he caught three sunfish with his basically toy rod. It's a little bit better. And me and the neighbor being the expert fisherman, caught nothing. But like when it was in the boat, like he had no idea what to do with the fish. And my bad metaphor is I feel like when I was starting out as a writer, like I really knew how to like haul a lot of stuff in. But I've got slightly better at knowing what you can kind of throw back. There's just a certain process of elimination that's become a bit easier, but I learned a lot writing this book, I think.
And how about for Infinite Country?
It's hard to say when a novel begins, like really begins, because I feel like the first embers, the first sparks of a novel go really far back. I mean, farther back than we even know, But when I kind of started to become conscious of it, I don't know, it was like 10 years ago, but I was writing other things, there were other novels that felt more urgent to me at the time. And those were the ones I was focused on writing. I still didn't have any idea what exactly the novel that turned out to be Infinite Country would be. I just had very early kind of flashes of that this would be a novel that, one day I would get to write. And I think that's pretty typical for writers. You kind of have just vague ideas of novels that you hope to write in the future, and maybe they'll happen or maybe they won't. But I didn't start writing, like actually writing, or seriously researching Infinite Country until after The Veins of the Ocean was published, which was in 2016, mainly because The Veins of the Ocean took so much out of me. There was so much research, and it was really a book that just took over my life and changed my life in a lot of ways, that when it was published, I for a while, I thought I was not going to write anything else ever again. I was like, well, that's it, you know? And so I took a long break. So I started writing, you know, the first draft of Infinite Country, I think, in July of 2018. And I actually wrote the first draft very quickly for me. I wrote the first draft in 4 months. And it was a much longer book. It was different from what it is now, but it was a draft, you know, it was something. And then I just, you know, did some very intense revising over the next year or two. But that's pretty quick for me as far as novels go, you know, to turn it around from, you know, writing to publication. But again, I can't say that it, you know, that its lifespan was in that period, because it already existed in, you know, my DNA a long time ago.
Patricia, if I can stay with you for a minute, how did you discover the voice for this book? Because it's a really distinct storytelling technique you're using here. And I don't want to give too much away, not that there's any giant reveal in the book, but you are sort of channeling the story of a family through one member of that family. And likewise, she is sometimes channeling the voices of her family members, telling their stories. And, you know, it's one thing to kind of find or know the subject matter of your book, but to find the voice to tell that story is, I think, maybe the biggest challenge for a lot of people. And I'm curious how you found it for Infinite Country.
You know, finding your narrative voice is one of the trickiest things when you're writing a book. I think my goal is always to have somebody who has all the knowledge necessary, who has the access to all the information, but also has the heart, who care about the story, right? So in the case of Infinite Country, as I worked on it, I realized, you know, in most families, I don't want to say every family, but in most families, I feel like there's somebody who's like the family, you know, storyteller, the one who's like the family memory, the family brain, who knows everyone's stories more than anyone else does. And as time goes by, is the person that people ask, like, what happened? How did this happen? What's our story, our family's story? So I've always felt, you know, I'm certainly that person in my family, kind of like the family witness, as I think a lot of writers are, you know, the one who's paying closest attention, who, you know, so I thought that would be who this character was. You know, she's the one invested in keeping everybody's stories, you know, thinks they're worth remembering, worth telling. Part of that is because, you know, in immigration, one of the things that's quickly lost, almost as quickly as language, are your stories, you know, the stories about who you were before you came here, what life was like, what we left, what we had, who we were, you know. All that can go away very, very quickly if you don't remember those stories and you don't repeat them. So she's on the front lines of that, you know, of being between the two generations, and where all that is, you know, at risk of being quickly lost, those stories. So it's a process of remembrance for her, and she has her own reasons for why she thinks that's important, why that's valid. And you find out that she's the one who's kind of the vessel for which all her family member stories are, they're being told to her, and she's the one recording them, you know, for her own reasons that you learn.
And John, how about for The Great Mistake? To give readers some sense of it, it's a really, it's an interesting voice, and you're channeling this sort of grand authorial voice of maybe 19th century or late 19th century literature, and then subverting it throughout the book and kind of moving into a much more intimate level than you would get from that sort of big historical sweeping authorial voice. And you're also integrating a lot of elements of newspaper language. The actual language of the day is worked into the storytelling here, and other other people's perspectives are brought in because you have this great structure where there's a murder and there is an investigation into the murder. So you occasionally have witnesses that come before the spotlight and have to tell their version of events. So it's this really unusual voice that I think gives us a tremendously sweeping vision of this man's life, and yet is also capable of going into the most intimate, personal, emotional moments. And I'm really curious how you found that voice.
I think through a lot of experimentation, I think there was a time when I wondered if it might be a first person novel, and that felt very wrong. I mean, I think any novel about a real historical figure is a kind of act of trespass, and you have to sort of accept that and try, and in a sense try and build that into what the book is about. But to be in his first person voice felt like a trespass too far in some sense. So I liked that writing it in the third person, but sometimes kind of a close third person, kind of gave me the elasticity I wanted. And I feel like every historical story is kind of a ghost story. And I mean, that's one of the reasons I actually really love the cover, because you get the sense of like the outline of a person, but to fill them in, you need to use your imagination somewhat. And it seemed to me that, you know, that the old line about eyewitness testimony being the most unreliable of all testimony, which is supposedly true, was interesting as well, because there were all these people who witnessed his murder, but also just witnessed him in life and had their own different versions of him that they projected onto him. And sometimes in the process of making that projection, they ended up revealing more about themselves than about him. So I wanted to reflect that a little bit too, that there are all these other voices colliding and kind of clamoring to own his voice, but he's the ghost that roams free. He's the kind of author of the book in a sense.
As a kind of closing piece of conversation, I'd like to talk a little bit about the titles of your books. And I know that the title of a book isn't necessarily the creation of its author, but let's assume that it's at least grown on you. And I'm really curious, and I'd like to start with you, John, but The Great Mistake and Infinite Country, these are really evocative titles. And I'd like to know what that title means to you. What do you see as, what does it signify, and what are the mistakes? And did as the book has come into fruition, come out into the world, has your sense of what it is and what it means evolved in any way?
Sure. I mean, I will say also that I love it, Infinite Country as a title, and
Great title.
it comes through so well in the book, that sense that sort of, you know, what if there's no nation or citizenry? Like, what if it's just territories of the mind and heart? With The Great Mistake, I think it's the only title I've ever come up with that stuck. Like that was the title from the outset, and it's the only time that it's stuck in that way. I think at one point my agent said to me right towards the end, like, you're gifting critics their headlines if you call your book The Great Mistake. Someone's going to write this big piece about how the whole book is a mistake. But I liked it too much by then. I just sort of seem like be bold and invite them to do whatever they want to do. You know, it sort of came initially from reading that the amalgamation, the creation of the 5-borough system, which Green was responsible for, among so many other things, was called The Great Mistake in the New York Times. And then it came from discovering, after I'd labeled the Word document The Great Mistake, I think being alive to mistakes and misunderstandings and errors in his life as I started to research it, and in his death too, because he was shot in what seems to have been a case of mistaken identity. So it became a big part of the book, and it sort of helped shape what the book became. And I was also finishing this book during the Trump era, and there was just something about disappearing into this document called The Great Mistake every morning that felt kind of right in some way, you know.
And how about Infinite Country, Patricia? Was that the title in your mind from the outset? Was it something that evolved as it went on? And what do you think it means?
Yeah, it was kind of the opposite of what happened with Jonathan. In the past, sometimes I've had the idea of a title And it's been that way from beginning to end, even if I had to like make a case for it with my publisher. With Infinite Country, the working title the entire time that I was writing it was The Jaguar, the Snake, and the Condor, which is why you see them on the cover. But when it came time to send it like out on submission, I just thought that was too long a title. So I just went reading the book, and Infinite Country was where it is, you know, towards the end of the book. And it seemed like a better fit. And so I went with it, but it wasn't my first title.
It seems to me to kind of capture so much about
Yeah,
themes
I'm
that
pleased
you're
with it now, but you know, it's funny how that happens. And I think that's also sometimes you don't know the book you're writing until it's done. And that's, you know, that's how I found my title.
I think that's an appropriate place for us to wrap up. And I want to remind everybody that these books are now available. You can have these books in your, if you don't have them already in your hand, you can have them in your hand in a matter of moments through some magic here. But it's The Great Mistake by Jonathan Lee is out now, and Infinite Country by Patricia Engel is also available, and you can read it on your own or through various book clubs that have selected it for the masses to enjoy. And these, I really do think that these are, as Jeff said earlier, the two books that are going to be standing at the end of the year. These are two of them, and these are the books that I think people are going to be reading and talking about for a long time. And so I hope that our viewers out there will join in the conversation and read these really powerful, moving works immediately. So please, everybody, read these books, buy these books. And we'd like to thank also, our hosts here in Magic City. Thank you so much for having us and for all the work you're doing in the community. And really thanks to everybody who joined us tonight too. It's a real treat to speak with you all. And Jonathan and Patricia, thanks again. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you, Jonathan and Dwyer. Thanks, Magic City, and everyone. It's been a pleasure. And get this amazing book.
Thanks, everyone. That was so fun.
Okay, take care.
Night.